and this is more kind of your sense of what the market is like. Obviously, we're preparing students here who are in master's programs or graduate certificate programs who want to advance in their career in HR. Do you feel HR a dynamic field, a challenging field, a growing field? What's your sense?
The chief people officers are saying, I talk to my CEO 4 or 5 times a day because they have to respond to an ever-evolving situation, which relates to people. So the chief people officer, group HR director, CROW, whichever acronym you use, has never had a more central seat. And Carl, you know this, I mean, we've been talking about how the HR function is evolving, how the HR leaders are evolving over the last number of years anyway. And that trusted advisor who kind of leads the most important asset in the organization, the human capital, really is a super critical role around the EXCO. Will it continue to be that way? Absolutely. Will the bar rise even higher for HR leaders? For sure. Because if you can't fill your seat around the EXCO during a crisis like this, you can't occupy the chief people officer's seat anymore, or kind of anything that leads into it, because you're mission critical. Well, I mean, they're all finding their way, right? No one has gone through anything like this before. So this is where kind of agility comes into play. And one of the things we can actually talk more about later on is how this crisis really became an opportunity for real people leaders to step up and be agile and just respond with empathy, care, but also clarity of thought. So how are people responding? People are responding by listening. People are responding by being very connected to their communities, to their networks, very connected to their local leadership, which is a bit of a change, and we can talk about that later as well. And just turning the empathy on and listening. And what started as safety of our people is going to now continue as we have to think about how we bring them back, both physically safely, but also how we take care of their mental health. And that's not just an HR officer conversation, it's a leadership and company conversation. To your point, we saw a lot of amazing examples of communication, rapid communication, authentic communication, and short communication. And again, an HR leader can't do that on their own. They had to bring kind of the whole senior leadership to the front lines to make sure that was happening. We saw incredible agile decision-making. So a lot of the silos, as we said, but then also a lot of the layers of decision-making had to be brought down, because you couldn't just make a decision at the top. You couldn't wait for 4 days for the decision to be made at the top. And again, HR took a lead role in kind of helping break down those silos. We talked about partnership. We think one of the most important things that's happening right now is purpose and values and mission and culture cannot be paper exercises. And that's what organizations have seen. So today, the difference between organizations who are actually emerging strong from the first phase of this are the organizations where, when you look at their leadership, you can say, our leadership has lived through this crisis living the values, as opposed to talking about the values. One of the unintended consequences of the crisis is the acceleration of digitalization across the entire organization. And that's both in terms of how we interact with our clients, our customers, and also how we interact with our employee base. Investments that were being kind of held have been now given to CIOs to make sure that an employee experience journey, for example, is actually reflected in the HR operations. And then there's also, again, I don't want to make a gross generalization, but there's probably increased appetite for innovation. Organizations are finding it okay for people to experiment and maybe fail, because the reality changed every 24 hours. You know, we've all shown, and there's a bad side to it, because, you know, how do you tell the blue collar workers that they have to go to work, for example, to keep the plant going, and your white collars can actually work from home? And isn't it great we have flexibility? So organizations need to kind of respond to that. But we've all proven that actually we can work flexibly. And a lot of the truths we were holding so dear, like we need these mega office spaces, we all have to show up at work, we all have to sit in cubicles, maybe that's being busted. So there will be a different way of working coming out of this. I don't think anyone is ready to commit to what that will look like just yet, because we're still struggling to figure out exactly how we're going to physically bring people back in. But definitely a lot of the myths have been busted. Consistently what we heard is, yes, we kind of need to rally the troops, but we need to do it in an authentic way. People don't need to hear a fairy tale. People need to hear that the organization is doing the best that it can by listening, by responding, and that the senior leadership is also struggling to find the answers, because nobody knows the answers right now. Now, it's very hard if you are in certain sectors where you really honestly are fighting for survival. Airlines, for example, etc., where it's really hard to keep the day in, day out engagement. And for other organizations who have to continue to live through this, the only thing that we hear is working for the time being is to tell it as it is, and to go back to the values, and to show that the organization is taking care of its people in the best way possible. And that's where kind of the other side of Carl's passion comes into play. How do you create the narratives? How do you tell the stories? How do you talk about how this organization is helping its community? What are the acts of kindness that are happening in the organization? So there is, what we hear in conversations is there is a practical element to this, which is, you know, what will the law require, and you know, how do we draw up the contracts? So there's some very, very practical stuff that's associated with it. And that's of course linked to job grades, that's linked to local kind of legal requirements, etc., etc. And then there's also the philosophical aspect of it, right? You know, how do you let some people do it and you don't let others? If it becomes a free-for-all, where do you put an end to it? So far, because it's still very raw and because it's still evolving, all we hear is that even when people start slowly coming back to the office, the leaders are suggesting that they're going to be as flexible as possible. Because they're kind of, there are a couple of things that need to be true for someone to come back into the office and maybe work the way they used to. There's the external thing. So when will the government say it's fine for us to come back in? There's the internal kind of the corporate policies, which will have to be rewritten one way or another, at least for the short term. But then frankly, the most important one perhaps is the internal permission. Your reality might be very different to my reality. I might have someone who's vulnerable that I'm living with at home, And how are you going to tell me that I should take the risk of commuting on the T to work? So it's a very thorny issue, and I'm afraid there's no one clear answer at this point.